Before contemplating anything else, it is worth contemplating how extraordinary it is that we are reflecting on the first year of Donald Trump's second term as US president at all. His first term ended in astonishing chaos in January 2021 as he refused to accept his loss of the 2020 presidential election and, at the very least, did not discourage an attempted putsch by his supporters. He was impeached for the second time by the House of Representatives, later convicted by one court of law for cooking the books to occlude a hush money payoff to a porn star, adjudged by another court to be a sexual assaulter, and more was becoming understood about his long friendship with human trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Nevertheless, in November 2024, 77.3 million American voters decided they wanted 4 more years. We have now, depending on one's perspective, enjoyed or endured 1. Trump's second term was always likely to be an even wilder ride than the first, and so it has proved. He is older, angrier, even more preoccupied with vengeance against his enemies, real and imagined, and the glorification of himself, to the extent of now having accepted 2 substitute Nobel Peace Prizes, one from FIFA, one from an actual winner, to compensate for the one to which he believes himself entitled. Trump's current administration is notably lighter than the previous, on reasonably sober and serious figures with some experience of governance, some understanding of how the world works, and some concern for the maintenance of the United States' global influence and reputation. Which may be why during his first year back in the Oval Office, Trump has menaced, threatened or attacked Iran, Venezuela, Panama, Cuba, Denmark, Colombia, Mexico and Canada. Apologies to anyone we forgot. What has President Trump's second first year meant for the United States at home and abroad? Is there a plan underpinning the chaos, or is the chaos the plan? And what might the next 3 years be like? This is the Foreign Desk.
At a time when they really want him to be laser focused on the economy and talking about things that his administration is trying to do to lower the cost of living for Americans, he's really struggled to do that.
Trump in his second term is like a little boy saying, I'm now going to take all the cookies that I was told that I couldn't have.
So much of presidential behavior is based on tradition, and I wonder if a Democratic president will indulge in some of the same exercises of power that they would not have indulged in before this second Trump term.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. For a look at what Trump's first year back has been like domestically, I'm joined first of all by Sabrina Siddiqui, national politics reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Sabrina, if we look back at the entirety of year 1, Trump 2, and I realise a lot has gone on, how does it look measured against what he actually said he would do before he was sworn back in?
Well, I think that it's been an interesting first year for President Trump's return to the White House, because the primary reason that he was elected in 2024 was because of the economy and cost of living and persistent inflation, a feeling among the average American that they can't afford to buy a house, they're paying too much for groceries, and he has actually really struggled with respect to the economy, which was always his strongest issue. I think a lot of frustration here at home remains over the fact that a majority of the American public simply doesn't believe that President Trump has done enough to rein in costs of living. On the other hand, there are objectives and goals that President Trump had that are much more familiar to his base and really that have been at the heart of his political identity since he first entered politics more than a decade ago, around immigration, where he has actually done a lot and continues to do a lot as he's been ramping up what his administration calls the largest deportation operation in American history. The images that we've been seeing of ICE agents across the country, but very heavy-handed tactics in order to achieve those goals. But that's probably where you've seen a lot more of Trump's promises that he made around immigration perhaps being met, even if through very unpopular methods.
I mean, there's a sense, I think, perhaps especially outside the United States, that there is a somewhat whimsical character to Trump as president, perhaps even more so in his second term. Does it feel like that inside the United States? Does this feel like whether you like it or agree with it or not, a coherent plan is being rolled out, or is it just whatever the thing of the day is?
It does seem a little bit less haphazard, if you will, than the first Trump administration. One of the things that's been striking is that pretty much no one has been fired from his administration in terms of the cabinet members or senior officials. When it was the first go around, it was almost like a running joke where it was like, okay, it's 6 p.m. on Friday, who's going to get the axe? Or it's 9 o'clock, is he going to tweet that someone's out? There was a lot more chaos just within the administration because there were a lot of things he was trying to do then that were unorthodox, but he had people who were trying to stop him from acting on his worst impulses. Whereas now it's very much a true MAGA administration and a MAGA White House. Everyone is there for it. There are very few people, if anyone, who's really telling him no. So I think there is actually more, to kind of come back to your question, of a methodical approach to what they're doing. Certainly on immigration, it is absolutely very deliberate. On tariffs, I think that's where it's been another big pillar of this first year, where he's very deliberately imposed these sweeping tariffs. But then, because there's been blowback from the business community, there's been challenges in the courts, there's been pushback from Republicans, that's where, they've kind of scaled back some of the tariffs or created some of these carve-outs. So maybe that's one thing where it hasn't gone according to plan.
You mentioned there the lack of people willing or able to say no to him, which is obviously a difference from his first administration. But is it clear whether he is still directing things or even attempting to direct things perhaps as much as he did 8 years ago? I mean, he is obviously 8 years older, as are we all, but he is notably frailer than he was as well. Is there any suggestion at all that he's not really in charge and it is various people trying to use him as a means for pursuing their own agendas?
It's a very interesting question. I think it depends on what it is that we're talking about. So some of it is not so much that other people are calling the shots. From our reporting, it's just that he's very distracted. It's always been hard for him to stay on message, but I think, and you've seen it with his age, it's even more challenging for President Trump to stay on message in a lot of his public appearances. And so at a time when they really want him to be laser focused on the economy and talking about things that his administration is doing or trying to do to lower the cost of living for Americans, especially when they're trying to hold on to the House and the Senate in these very important midterm elections in November, he's really struggled to do that and to even really keep his message focused on the economy and cost of living, which is the number one issue for Americans in poll after poll. And I think that's where you've seen more of those signs that, yes, he's always been kind of all over the place and rambling through his speeches, but it seems to be even more challenging for him to really stay focused on domestic priorities and what Republicans want him to do. And he seems a little bit more focused on his own personal grievances and his own personal objectives that are more around legacy building and reshaping the U.S. government in his image.
Do you get any sense, though, that the loyalty of his base, the MAGA base, is holding up quite as well as it once did? Because there's obviously been the roiling fuss over the Epstein files, which he is clearly reluctant to release entirely for some scarcely imaginable reason. But there's also been, I think, some suggestions of discomfort with overreach, to put it mildly, by ICE officers, particularly in Minnesota, and particularly with reference to the recent killing of Renee Good.
The base is interesting, the MAGA base. We still see in our own polling at the Wall Street Journal and all the polls that are taken, granted, you have to take polls with a grain of salt, as we've seen in recent years, but we see strong support for President Trump in all the numbers. If you're just talking to Republicans, he often is still at like, if you're just talking about support for President Trump, he's often still in the high 80s, 90s, even in some polls among Republican voters. But there have been frustrations, there have been cracks that very much do stem from, I think, the Epstein investigation primarily, because there was a lot of frustration. That's one of the issues where he's had the lowest approval ratings from Republicans, particularly what people see as a lack of transparency, because he had campaigned on releasing the so-called Epstein files, and then his administration, was dragging its feet, and they still haven't been fully transparent. So there's just been, and you've seen someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a staunch ally of President Trump's, who has very publicly broken from him over that and other issues. And I think when I talk to Republican voters, I will say, and I'm not trying to keep hitting on the same point, but Republican voters I've spoken to, there are quite a few of them who also are frustrated just that everything is still so expensive, and they thought that he was going to lower cost of living. I think on ICE, it's a little bit more polarizing. I think on ICE, Republicans have actually very much been willing to allow President Trump to reshape immigration policy and even test the limits of presidential power. And his administration is very good at controlling the narrative and often spreading misinformation about immigration in this country, and even who's at fault in the killing of Renee Good, where even if the video makes it very clear that she was not a threat to the officer, but where he is losing people on immigration tactics and the heavy-handed approach that his administration has taken is independents and some of the swing voters. So these are not the MAGA voters, but it's people who voted for Obama, then voted for Trump, and then they maybe voted for Biden in 2020, and then they went back to Trump in 2024. Those are the people he's losing, because those are the people who are looking around and saying, hey, wait a minute, when you talked about a secure border, we were all for it, but we didn't mean you're going to send agents patrolling, American neighborhoods, rounding up people at restaurants and showing up at schools and apprehending our neighbors and law-abiding immigrants who are here just trying to make a living. We thought you were talking about violent criminals, and it's very clear that that's not what the administration was talking about. So I think that's where he's been losing support from people who are what we would call Trump voters. But I think the MAGA faithful is very much behind him, even if they have some disagreements.
That was Sabrina Siddiqui, national politics reporter at the Wall Street Journal. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. For a look at Trump's recent endeavours in foreign policy, joining us now is Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic, where this week he has published an essay with the discouraging title, Trump is Risking a Global Catastrophe. Tom, let's start with the obvious question. In terms of foreign policy, has Trump 2 been notably different from Trump 1?
Absolutely. There's no one to tell him no now. He had a bunch of ideas, including things like taking Greenland and lots of other kooky plans. But there were people around him who said, look, it's a bad idea. We have other things we have to do, who could sway him away from that. And also in his first term, he had other plans. I mean, he ran surrounded by people who actually had ideas about doing certain things. Now, this time around, he ran, there were people who definitely had the Project 2025 playbook. But really, Trump ran this time, and I've said this many times, he ran for 3 reasons: to stay out of jail, get revenge on his enemies, and line his pockets. And, that leaves a lot of time for a lot of other oddball projects. In his first term, he actually was interested in things like submitting a budget and, addressing Congress and other things, because he had people around him who were interested in the normal business of governing. Now he's just unleashed. He can do everything that people told him he shouldn't do. Trump in his second term is like a little boy saying, I'm now going to eat all the birthday cake. I'm now going to, take all the cookies that I was told that I couldn't have. You see it with tariffs, for example. In his first term, he wanted to do tariffs. And there were responsible people around him who said, you're basically going to crash the economy if you do this. And this time around, there wasn't anybody there to say, no, global tariffs are a bad idea. So that's why we ended up with them. And Greenland is another case like that.
I do want to come back to Greenland because obviously emissaries from Greenland and Denmark have been visiting Washington, D.C. this week trying to make their case. But before we look at that case in isolation, is there at least some sense of coherence in what we have seen so far, in that it has been a series of actual or threatened short, sharp shocks, whether they've been directed at Nigeria or Venezuela or may yet be directed at Iran, because that's not necessarily incongruent with this idea that we're not doing long-term nation building anymore.
Well, the thing is, he's doing a lot of things that he ran against doing. This was an America First platform. We were going to ignore the rest of the world. We weren't going to be, running around sending our military forces hither and yon. And now he's doing that. And I think, again, it's because this is an extension of his personality. I don't see the thread in this that perhaps other people might see. Someone comes in and says, Mr. President, they're doing bad things to Christians in Nigeria. Okay, good. Show me somebody to bomb there. Let's take out Maduro because something oil. And I think part of it, and I think an important thing for people to understand is that, like a lot of would-be authoritarian leaders, he's gravitating toward the use of military force abroad because he has become frustrated at home. And so he wants to be able to have things to brag about, to have wins where he can say, I caved in some bad guys in Nigeria and I took out a bad guy in Venezuela. But I think a lot of this is meant to be a distraction by how quickly his whole project ran out of gas here at home. And I think people, even Americans, underestimate how badly off he is compared to a year ago. His poll numbers have cratered. The enemies that he all wanted to get even with have humiliated him in court, one after another. He has lost important cases where he's had to, withdraw his attempt to control the state National Guards. He's let ICE become a rogue agency. And for the first time since ICE was formed, American public opinion is now a majority against ICE, which is a new development. Well done. It's quite an achievement to get Americans to turn against their immigration cops. I mean, it really is a mess. And so the only institution in American life that can't say no to him when he wants to go and do something really off the wall is the American military. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of these military adventures, because people come in and they say, don't worry, sir, it's going to be like you said, short, sharp and shocking. And, it'll be a quick win and it's going to look great and it'll grab the news cycle and people will stop talking about Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, let's come back to Greenland then, because that does seem to be the one that has preoccupied him even more than his threats to annex Canada or invade Cuba or Panama or, apologies to anybody I've forgotten. As an idea in itself, and bearing in mind that he's not the first US president to have thought about this, I believe Harry Truman made discreet inquiries shortly after World War II, but in theory, does his idea of annexing Greenland make any sense whatsoever?
None. Harry Truman, the world of the 1940s is a very different place. I mean, we're talking about a world where, if you're thinking about a global contest with the Soviet Union, a much more powerful state at the time, and the world operated on things like propeller-driven aircraft. I feel like this is old Cold War nostalgia, the distant early warning line and, these other things, because we didn't have satellites. We didn't have this kind of ability to look at the whole Earth from space. So yeah, if you were worried that Stalin was going to send prop-driven bombers toward New York, Greenland becomes really important. And Greenland is still important. As I said in the piece I wrote in The Atlantic, Greenland is very important to North Atlantic security. Denmark knows this. America knows this. That's why America and Denmark and Greenland are part of something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is sovereign territory administered and under the Kingdom of Denmark. And Trump's constant refrain about, well, China's going to get it or Russia's going to get it is just bonkers. It's just lunacy. We already can do anything in Greenland we want to do. And the Greenlanders came here just the other day and said, do you want more bases? Do you want more radar? Just tell us what you want. We're happy to cooperate. You are our ally. Denmark is one of America's oldest allies. We've been allied to Denmark longer than we've been allied to Britain, a lot longer than we've been allied to Britain. I honestly believe that part of what's going on, and I know this is going to sound crazy to people, I think he looked at a Mercator projection on a map and said, he did in fact say, it's massive. And he looked at this map and said, it's massive and we have to have it. And once he gets an idea in his head, you can't shake him off it. And of course, then comes as I mentioned earlier, that secondary problem where people say, Mr. President, you can't just take Greenland. And he says, oh, yeah? You're telling me I can't? Well, now I have to.
But that's where we have to, in closing, consider the possible consequences. And I guess there's a big question which I will attach to the smaller question of what if the United States did do something precipitate in Greenland. That would obviously, you would have to think, spell the end of NATO, and that could have fairly obvious second, third, fourth or fifth order consequences, none of them good. But as we sort of think 1 year down, 3 to go, how weird are you concerned this could still get?
I'm really concerned. I didn't enjoy writing this article. I mean, I had to sit there and think through, okay, what if Trump suddenly declares, as he is wont to do, right? In the middle of the night, he issues a post and he says, I am now the Lord Protector of Greenland. Greenland is American territory. And of course, the rest of the world says, as they often do in these cases, they say, well, he'll sleep that off, whatever. But then he says, now I'm going to enforce it. And I'm going to treat Greenland's airspace as American airspace. I'm going to tell American forces in Greenland not to obey any orders from the local authorities. And if there are protests, we're going to be the de facto police. And sooner or later, somebody's going to get killed. And it could be a Greenlander. It could be a Danish military person. It could be British, French military people that are there now as a show of support. At that point, NATO goes up in flames. And at that point, the Russians and the Chinese do start thinking about making moves. I think in particular, the Russians will say, great, now I can get out of this Ukrainian situation by isolating and bombarding the Baltic states and really, bury NATO under the ashes once and for all here. And that could lead to World War III.
That was Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Finally, on today's show, dare we wonder, after the year we have had, what the next 3 years of President Trump's second term might be like. Joining me now is Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for Europe for the New York Times. Stephen, let's start at the end of Trump's second term and maybe work our way back. Do we yet have an idea of what Trump's ideal of the United States circa 2028 will look like?
At this point, he wants it to be bigger. Now, how much bigger, we'll see. I mean, he looks at Greenland like building a bigger ballroom in the East Wing of the White House. He wants to put his name on it in history. He's very eager to go down into history. He's a kind of old-fashioned Western Hemisphere imperialist. And he's had Greenland on the mind since like 2017, 2018. He talked to the Danes about trying to buy it in 2019. So he's been thinking about it. He talks, I think, jokingly about annexing Canada. He certainly is pretty serious about what he did in Venezuela, right? Mm-hmm. Now, he did it in the pretext of combating drug running and illegal migration. But he made it very clear very quickly, to him it was about the oil, and it was about American power, and kicking out the Chinese and the Russians from Venezuela. And he and Marco Rubio seem to have Cuba on their minds also. So I think his view when he leaves office will be of an America that's expanded in size, that has reinforced its domination over the Western Hemisphere, certainly over Latin America, that is worried less about Europe, wants Europe to do more for itself, and that has good economic relations somehow with Russia. I mean, he is still fascinated by resetting relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia. He thinks there's great deals to be done, and obviously with Xi Jinping, which is a kind of obsession that comes and goes. But I think this is Trump's view of an America that's larger, more feared, less involved in multilateral institutions, less involved in the kinds of organizations that rely on American money to do nice things. He'd rather do them himself. It's very, very much America first and America's interests first, and alliances are not very important to him.
If he continues going about pursuing all that, though, in the manner that he has in his first year, how realizable do you think any of that actually is, or is something likely to crack before then?
Well, I worry that America is going to crack, but that's a different problem. I do think it's overambitious. I don't think we're going to invade Greenland, but you never know. I really don't think so. But I do think he is, as he often does, throwing a grenade into the water to put pressure on people to see what happens. He has a different relationship with Mexico. He keeps talking about going after the drug gangs in Mexico. He's already done a lot to shut the border with Mexico. He's reduced illegal migration. I think that is fair to say. That was one of his promises. And I think his desire for a lovely relationship with Putin will be disappointed. At home, of course, there are other issues that we can certainly talk about. But in terms of abroad, I think he will have undermined NATO alliance's trust in the American credibility, in the American alliance. He will have undermined faith that many in the world have that America will be there when there's trouble, an earthquake, a plague, by cutting USAID, I think. They've done a lot of damage to America's reputation. And you can see also in the Middle East, he is, on the one hand, a supporter of Israel, but also is pushing Israel around because he wants a regional settlement. I mean, he's very interested in better relations with the Gulf, the Saudis, the UAE, and it is not just an Israel first agenda. I mean, he would like to go down as having broadened the Abrahamic Accords, and it brought some more stability to that region. I don't think he cares much about the Palestinians, certainly from the evidence. I mean, what Israel's doing in the West Bank, what it had done in Gaza doesn't bother him very much. But I do think in the end, for business reasons, oil reasons, energy reasons, the Gulf is something that attracts him quite a lot. And I think he wants to reset American policy to be more favorable toward the Gulf states.
You mentioned earlier the prospect of the United States itself cracking, at which we should talk a little bit about the possibilities on the domestic front. Does it strike you that whether advertently or otherwise, some sort of crunch is coming?
Well, it's a very divided country. This much we know. You know that from all the elections. In a presidential election, it's only a matter of a few states that make the difference, because the red states are red and the blue states are blue, and there are only a few up in the air. So this makes politics very, very divisive and angry sometimes, and that's going to continue. My assumption is, I could be wrong, that the Democrats will take the House of Representatives in the midterms in November. And that would be a check on presidential power. And it's also true that this really is Trump's last term, whether he likes it or not. And he's been trying very hard to push back the date of lame duck-itis, where people look beyond this president toward who might be the next president and to the next election. He's managed to push that back a bit, but that's an inevitable occurrence in American politics. It's like trying to fight age. It's there and it's going to happen. But what worries me more than anything is the way he has, with the help or perhaps guidance of more ideological people on the right, like Vance, J.D. Vance, and Steve Miller, he has been using the American government to punish people who've opposed him. He's particularly manipulated or had his Department of Justice manipulated to go after people who have offended him or who sought to bring charges against him. And he's gone after the universities. He has created a lot more division in America, I think, and made it much more ideological. And I think there's obviously going to be a blowback. The other thing that worries me, honestly, is so much of presidential behavior is based on tradition, not legality. And he's broken through many of these traditions. And I wonder if a Democratic president will, if there is another one next time, will indulge in some of the same exercises of power that they would not have indulged in before this second Trump term.
Well, just finally then, because we do like to attempt to close on an at least slightly upbeat note, as you look ahead to the coming 3 years of Trump 2.0, is there anything that you're optimistic about? Any grounds for thinking it might not be as bad as the worst case scenarios?
Well, yes. I mean, in the sense that I think Trump has been correct in pushing Europe and the NATO countries to spend more on their own defense. This is long overdue. They are much more awake to the threat of an aggressive Russia. They are also less reliant, or soon to be less reliant, on United States guarantees. So Europe will have to step up. I think people are beginning to realize this is a generational struggle with Russian imperialism, and that Europe is rich enough and smart enough to do a much better job in its own conventional defense. As the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, said to me, Europe doesn't have to be the United States. It just has to be better than Russia. And it certainly can do that.
Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for Europe for the New York Times. Thanks for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.